Okay, hello and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining on the third consecutive day. And you know how quickly the time flies. And today is the last and the third day of the 3 day night school. And I'm already feeling sad about it. And in the past 2 days, we have seen, what is Web of Life, especially from the systems approach. And yesterday we had a very wonderful and terrific, discussion on the food, particularly the food and the entire connectivity associated with, how systems can actually influence the political systems, the biology, and also the psychology of food as well. So today it's going to be the last day, and we are going to talk about the building resilience. And Radha is already here, and there is also a request to have some kind of recap of what we have done in the past 2 days, which she has readily obliged. Let me quickly, tell you a word or two about Dr. Radha Gopalan, those who have joined today, and they may be wondering, who is this wonderful, environmental scientist. So, uh, Radha has received a PhD in environmental studies from IIT Bombay. And after that, she has been teaching at different schools in different capacities. And she's also the environmental consultant and associated with Azim Premji University as an adjunct faculty, and was also part of the publication that they bring. And she's a well-trained yoga teacher. Her interests are varied. There are so many other things that she likes apart from environment as such. So I think with that introduction, I am going to hand it over to Radha. I once again welcome Radha to this third and the final day.
Thanks a lot, Nick. And it's lovely to see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces as well. So it's like we've become this little community, where we are engaging so actively in issues that are not just challenges for the present, but also are going to significantly shape the future of our existence. And so we started off on the first day, sort of putting forth a kind of a framework with which to view and try and understand these challenges. And the idea that was put forth was that if we were to look at the planetary challenges, or if we were to look at life on Earth, if we were to look at life on Earth as a network of relationships, then maybe, we begin to understand life in a very different way. We stop looking at it, in the form of silos, in a fragmented fashion, and begin to really understand these connections, interconnections, relationships, the cycles of life that exist, the rhythms and patterns. And through this understanding, can we then look at the challenges that we face? What are the causes of these challenges? And not just the causes that are that we often come across in terms of you sort of very specific causes, or we look at them as problems and solutions, but to really look at these as changes that happen around us in the environment around us, changes that happen in socio-ecological systems, and how and what is the response of the socio-ecological system to these changes, and then what is the new condition that results. And when this new condition creates a different situation, what is the response to that? Right? So this is not about discrete problem solution, which means you sort of see an end to something, because many of these things are not just one-off events. It's, they're not sort of it's not like we're trying to get rid of water pollution, or we're trying to get rid of something like that, right? Something very specific. But here we're looking at and the way we look at these issues as well, the way we understand these issues as well, to really try and get to the relationship between various systems and subsystems in the socio-ecological milieu. And we had proposed a kind of a nested systems approach on the first day, where we said, okay, we are embedded in larger systems. So, for example, the individual is part of a household, and the household is part of the larger societal, social, ecological, economic system, and then we're all part of the larger Earth system. So, if we see ourselves as being nested like that, then we begin to understand how we are related and through these relationships. So, why is it important to understand these relationships? It's because anything that is done at one point or at one level has an impact somewhere else. So only when we begin to understand these relationships and these hidden connections are we able to then make some sense of what's happening and then therefore modify our responses so that the damage that is likely to be caused or the degradation that is likely to be caused could be mitigated or minimized. So, yesterday, of course, we talked quite a bit about the food system, and we placed the food system in this sort of web of life view. And we essentially looked at the various factors, the various elements of the food system, and we focused a lot on the industrial food system, which is really the dominant food system that we're all a part of. And we sort of looked at what are the various influences on this food system, and how are the various pieces of this food system interrelated. Now, while it's very important, and from the point of view of science, when I think about it, or when I think about it just from the point of view of learning, while it's very important for us to understand the details, it is important for us to break a system down or to break a whole down to understand the individual parts. But then it's also very, very important to see how these parts fit together, and that the whole is much more than merely an assemblage of its parts. And that is the complexity of life and of the systems we approach. So we looked at the industrial food system and realized that it's not just about um, choosing what we eat. It's not just about the brand of milk or the brand of oil or the brand of food that we buy. It's not about whether it's rich in carbohydrates or vitamins or fats. It's not just about those single elements which we seem to often get trapped into, but it is about some structural influences. There are several structural elements that make this food web what it is. So there is the economic aspect of food systems, there is the political aspect of food systems, there is the ecological and the social aspect of food systems. So from a supply point of view, if we were to look at, agriculture is deeply influenced by the policies, right? And policies are deeply influenced by geopolitical influences. We are no more, no nation is anymore about its own its policies limited to its boundaries. It is about geopolitical influences which deeply affect this food system. And they deeply affect not just what we consume, but also the people who produce our foods. And eventually it goes down to the livelihoods of the small and marginal communities and small and marginal farmers who are the backbone of the food system in India and in many Asian countries and in many countries in Africa as well. Whether it is milk production, whether it is meat, whether it is vegetables, whether it's fruits, whether it's grain, right? So what we were looking at yesterday was how these structural elements, such as policies, geopolitics, the social arrangements, the economic system, the choices we make as consumers, the production systems, the distribution systems, the cultural elements, right? How all of these inform this very complex food web. And now that and how the industrial food system has sort of moved us away from diversity to uniformity. The focus of the industrial food system is to homogenize and to make everything uniform so that whether it is corporations or whether it's political systems can have greater control over our resources and over the food. And we know for a fact that whoever controls food systems and food security really controls life significantly. And we also talked about the role of agribusiness in how it has influenced what we consume and the choices we make. Right. So moving on from this food web, this is a really sort of a very good point for us to look at. So now we know, we know that there are significant issues, that there are significant challenges. So knowing this, right, what does it mean for the future? Is it something that we have to live with? You know, is this industrial food system the only way to feed ourselves? We know very clearly that it is absolutely driving life to the ground. It's responsible for not just one of the biggest challenges that the planet faces, which is global warming induced climate change, but also very, very recently what we're going through, which is a manifestation of zoonosis, which is again a manifestation of the erosion and the clearance of forests and natural ecosystems, to which one of the biggest contributors is the industrial food system. So from that point, I thought we would use the first few minutes to really try and bring about this connection between what we've been talking over the last 2 days to today. So this vulnerability of modern food systems that we talked about yesterday, we know that it's high, right? Even before COVID-19. So yesterday we were talking about the problems of long supply chains and how, because the supply chains were so long and they were concentrated in specific areas, the world's food system got impacted, right? But the vulnerability of these systems was well known even before what we're facing today, right? Whether it was the oil crisis in the 1970s, subsequently, as evidence, they kept mounting about global warming induced climate change and how the large dependence on fossil fuel in modern food systems, okay, whether it is production, distribution, transportation, the huge dependence on that, and overconsumption as well. The huge dependence on fossil fuels, how that has contributed to global warming, which is then in turn induced climate change. And then in 2007, 2008, we had the big financial crisis, where what then was revealed to us was that there are several food crops which are being treated as commodities and which are being speculated about in the market, in trading markets. So then that in itself also had a significant impact, and that is what controls price fluctuations and price spikes all over the world, which in turn actually trickles down to impacting livelihoods of farmers who grow our food. Because when, and most countries in the world today are deeply integrated into globalization and the global market. So when global prices begin to affect local prices, they deeply affect the livelihoods of people who produce our food, because it's no more about them receiving the purchasing price that they receive is not greater than their production cost. It's about driving prices down as much as possible. So for small farmers, small and marginal farmers, the purchasing price, the price at which their grain or their milk or their meat is purchased is at a much lower price than is required for them to produce it, which means they get into a debt trap. So this kind of commodification of food has seriously impacted livelihoods all over the world. And then we've also had the SARS and the Ebola outbreaks. There has been the African swine fever. So we've had epidemics before, which have very clearly pointed to this element of zoonosis that we talked about yesterday, which is the jumping of a virus or a bacterial infection from wildlife to livestock and then to human beings, which is sort of what has happened with COVID-19 through the SARS-CoV-2. And it's also happened with African swine fever and the whole bunch of viruses and disease-causing organisms that we talked briefly about yesterday. And then, of course, more recently, there have been the trade disputes, and the most notable ones between the United States and China. And India has also been a part of some of the trade disputes with the United States. So there has been a significant amount of market disruption that has happened as a result of trade disputes, right, of imports and exports. So that has also impacted modern food systems. And yesterday we talked briefly about chicken's legs, right? Chicken legs, which the United States is pushing into India, and it has also challenged India at the WTO, because India has refused to import those chicken legs. So, and we know that one of the biggest issues about meat is, and particularly mass-produced meat, not so much any meat, but it's mass-produced, industrial scale produced meat, is that it is deeply loaded with antibiotics, hormones, and other chemicals. So there are nutritional and health-related issues as well. And also we know, we know from the COVID-19 experience that when you have mass production of, and particularly industrial scale production of livestock, then you do create crowding conditions which are very conducive for transmission of viruses. And also you have people, literally people who are also organized in these assembly chains. And there are very many newspaper reports about how food facilities or food processing facilities, whether it was Tyson in the United States or in Germany, or Tuning in Germany, because of the way people have to be crowded in order to process these, the incidences of COVID-19 actually multiplied significantly in these facilities. So therefore, the vulnerability, so what COVID-19 has done is basically it has, sort of bared this vulnerability, right? And in the context of India, it's important for us to maintain this Indian context here when we're talking about resilience, because it's useful to maintain a given context that we're familiar with, and then sort of understand the wider context, knowing what is happening in our own country and what is happening with our food system. So when COVID-19 struck, of course, one of the things that that a lot of people talked about, that India has a demographic advantage because we have a lot of young people, and so unlike Europe, in India, the incidence of the disease or the severity of the disease may be much lower. But we also know this, that the non-communicable diseases, which are called lifestyle diseases, because of how we consume and what we consume, they are very high in the 30 to 50 age group, particularly among more affluent Indians, right? And making them therefore more susceptible to this virus, which we know makes people with, comorbid conditions more vulnerable. And you also, and like we talked about yesterday, the modern, the industrial food system has been a big contributor to NCDs. The entry of a huge amount of processed foods into our country, the high consumption of certain kinds of foods by sections of society, the lack of access to nutritious food by other sections of society. So there is this triple burden that we talked about on the first day as well as yesterday. So, and at one end, there's overconsumption, obesity, etc., which has compromised certain sections of people to the viral infection. And at the other end, there is malnutrition, which has been triggered by the agrarian crisis, by the erosion of our traditionally diversified food systems. And more often than not, our responses have been in the form of technical fixes, right? Whether it is fortification or, whether it is biofortification or chemical fortification of foods, we have sort of responded with technical fixes. Also, what has happened as a result of this lockdown is there has been a reduced access to fresh and healthy foods in many situations. That also compromises immunity. The supply chains that we talked about yesterday, long and complex at various points, were blocked. So, and most importantly, we are, and this is the thing about doing a systems approach, right? A systems view. It is also that one of our biggest problems is there is a lack of access to quality, affordable public health care in this country. So from here, if we were to then move forward and say, so what is the relevance of a systems view? So let's sort of re-look at this relevance of the system. One thing we all know from the last 2 days we've talked about, and also many of us have thought about this. This is not, what we were discussing yesterday and day before is not new at all. But what a systems view does is that it allows us to understand that there are some structural, elements that we need to sort of really pay attention to. Okay, these are not one-off things. These are not discrete events. We have to, and through the systems, we were able to understand, by understanding these relationships, we were able to understand the underlying structure that is a part of these foods, in this case, the food system. And we were not looking at them as single elements or units. We were looking at them as subsystems. Right? We also understood, how these relationships interact. What is this network? What does this network look like? What are the cycles that are a part of life? How does it all flow? How does the material flow? How does energy flow? What are the patterns which are part of these systems that we discussed, right? Of life systems. And another thing that systems view does for us is also, because we understand these relationships, we also know where the weak links are. Like if we were to think about the analogy of a spider's web, we also know where the web is thinnest, where it's likely to break easily, right? And then we're able to sort of address that inflection point. We're able to address that point and say, okay, this is where we need to be working a little bit more in order to be able to sort of restore integrity to this web, right? And yesterday we were talking about this. This is not new to human thinking. This whole thing about systems view is not new to human thinking. What is interesting, what has happened more recently, is modern science, and a lot of scientists are beginning to really push back and be very vocal about the need to look at life on this earth through an ecosystems approach, through understanding life with this lens of systems view. Now, it's been an integral part of cultural traditions, ways of indigenous communities. In India, we have the whole idea of Jal Jangal Zameen, or in Latin America, the idea of Summa Causae, which is, sort of a good life, really. It's about looking at all these interconnections and looking at life as an entity, looking at life as being this, to some extent, a messy, complex, but a very exciting, interlinked, interrelated, sort of being, if you'd like to call it that. Also, scientists in the 70s, like James Lovelock and later Lynn Margolis, the microbiologist, have talked to us about the Gaia theory, which was poo-pooed quite a bit in the early 70s. And now more recently, more and more scientists, particularly quite a few physicists, have come forth and asking us to sort of relook at this whole concept of Gaia. And what is the Gaia theory? Very briefly, what does the Gaia theory say? The Gaia theory says that the earth is a self-regulating mechanism, that it is that, this interrelationship. So the earth is basically a complex interrelationship with the biosphere, the atmosphere, oceans, soils. So in school ecology, we used to call it the abiotic and the biotic elements, that they're all actually interrelated and they're so deeply interconnected, and there is a constant communication between them. And that the Earth, the planet Earth, is actually a self-regulating entity. And it's trying to maintain, so it's not very different from the human body, where we're trying to maintain a homeostasis, where the body responds, whenever you have changes in the body is trying to maintain that 37.4 degrees centigrade temperature in the body. So there is a very, very complex set of biochemical, physiological activities that keep taking place in the human body in order to maintain that body temperature, or that homeostasis, as we would like, as we call it in physics and chemistry, right? So the Earth is not very different from that, is what the Gaia theory was talking about. Okay. And now here, I know that I'm sure you can't see the details in this cycle of life, but this is just an example from Adivasi community, the Savaras, right? Who have viewed their life cycle, who have viewed their life, who have viewed their very deeply integrated with natural system life in this cyclic form. They have represented the relationships in this cyclic form. So here is a very very sophisticated understanding of interrelationships between agriculture, the festivals, the forests, the changes in the forests and in natural patterns and rhythms, for which they have ways of monitoring, because there are indicators that they use to monitor the change in, for example, fruiting patterns, flowering patterns, migration of birds and animals, the way animals respond to changes in climate, and how human beings have a very intuitive and a very close understanding of that, because of the kind of approach to life that has been an integral part of many of these communities. So yesterday we were talking about, yesterday and day before as well, we were talking about the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle. which which biology or ecology teaches us. But you can see how sophisticated that understanding is in many of these communities. So yesterday somebody had asked, I think it was I'm not sure who it was, but had asked about the fact whether, is this something new, and is this not something that we've understood, and what about indigenous communities? So now here is an example, and I'm just giving you this as an example. There are innumerable such representations that are available with indigenous communities all over the world. But this was just to provide an illustration of the fact that this is not new, but we seem to have moved very far away from this fundamental understanding of life on Earth. So now, very recently, like I was saying, a lot more scientists are pushing back very hard, particularly in the event of COVID-19, in nature communications. And this was one of the references that I had provided as a reading that could be useful. And so the thing that a lot of scientists have been warning about, and sort of I'm narrowing down to, is this idea of consumption. That consumption is what is driving the planetary challenges. And yesterday, I think I talked about it very briefly, that it's affluent consumption, right? Because when we talk about consumption, there is this is another problem, right? When we talk about issues like population and consumption, there is a tendency to provide a very broad brush, right? Rather than sort of look at context, and rather than understand that broad brush just doesn't work because it is so context specific. Now, for example, when we talked yesterday about consumption of animal products, right? Yes, for affluent consumption of animal products and overconsumption of animal products needs to be completely re-looked at, and there needs to be a complete reduction in that. But you cannot apply that to somebody who is suffering from malnourishment and say that animal product consumption needs to be cut across the board and that it has to be a policy decision. You cannot, because at that level of malnutrition, it is animal products that provide the micronutrients that are required in order to move out of that state of hunger, that state of wasting, and that state of stunting or state of anemia. So therefore here, in this recent publication, scientists have specifically focused on the issue of affluent consumption and its relationship to capitalism and the economic model that is the dominant model today. So they've laid out sort of three things that they're talking about. It's through high consumption, through the fact that the affluent consumers are part of the capital class, which in turn then drives the consumption norms across the population. So what have been the responses? So what do we say? How do we get out of this situation? So some of the and how do we build resilience, right? So some of the sort of suggestions that have always come forth have been, we need to have a technological change, right? And but technological change often, is, very, very often it is seen as that it actually brings down some of the impacts that are caused as a result of the very many challenges we talked about. So technology becomes the solution. Then green growth, right? So green growth is also seen as a mitigation option, and there is a huge push towards green growth as well as through what is called the Green New Deal in the United States. Okay, so where of course renewable energy and renewable technologies, right? So now we have to understand this, right? When we're talking about moving forward. Now, renewable energy also has resource requirements. It also requires land. It requires rare earth elements. It requires energy. Right? It requires energy in order to be able to produce these technologies. So when we talk about renewable energy, we talk about green growth, and the scientists have put forth the idea that any kind of growth, right? When we talk about growth, it is always pushing a demand for resource. It is pushing a demand for energy sources, right? So it's very, very important to talk in terms of consumption. Yeah, even when we talk about the Green New Deal or green growth, it is very important to look at it from the point of view of consumption. And unless consumption is brought down, the main argument here is that unless consumption is brought down, for example, renewable energies, right? Renewable technologies, unless you bring down, you have to accompany renewable energy or renewable technologies with a reduction in consumption of energy, because otherwise you're replacing fossil fuel with a renewable technology, which again in turn depends on resources, right? Say, for example, if you're talking about, solar energy, or you're talking about wind energy, whether it is solar panels or whether it is the wind turbines, and even our smartphones today, right? They have a huge demand on lithium, on rare earth elements, which are mined in under conditions which lead to tremendous amount of environmental contamination, and more so in parts of the world which have a significant number of indigenous communities and marginalized communities. So it's very important. The argument here is that central to this whole issue of looking for an alternate way of being, to looking towards building resilience on the planet, is to look at it from the perspective of consumption. Okay? And so here again, some of the things that we talked a little bit about yesterday are reiterated in this paper as well, where it says that the imperative, therefore, is to look at a structural change in the socio-economic system, right? We need to be redefining many of the socio-economic ideas that we take for granted, or we are conditioned to believe that there's no other way to be, right? Also, with a very strong need to re-examine and understand what are globally considered benchmarks, like, say, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has put out. So it's very important to first understand, question, really look at what do these mean. So I've just taken one example, right? So the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them, which are aimed for greater sustainability by 2030. But one of the goals there, SDG 8, talks about decent work, which is, and economic growth, right? And again, economic growth. So what does this economic growth mean, right? Because it can be very contradictory if you're looking at if you're looking at the definition of economic growth as we see it today, and if we are not looking at this issue of consumption. And the definition of economic growth, any classical economist will tell you, is so closely linked to consumption, isn't it? So, and then also another imperative that this paper talks about is the shift in relationship between the state, the citizen, and civil society. And a lot of this we did talk about yesterday as well. Okay, so like, for example, even with COVID-19, right? There has been such an authoritarian response to COVID-19. And a lot of public health specialists have talked about, particularly in India, we've had leading public health specialists who've said that, civil society and community, it should have been strongly led by civil society and community, so that we understand why we are doing some things and not have to bring it down through the use of military and military force, right? But it also should have required much greater investment in public health, in food security. So instead of that kind of an approach, most countries have led through an authoritarian response from top down. And of course, education is such an important part of any kind of approach, thinking that we're going to do for the future, that we need to do today for the future. And in that, interdisciplinarity is a very, very important element to, and this is where systems thinking and being able to break silos and move reasonably seamlessly to be able to communicate with each other, to be able to use a shared vocabulary is so important. And I must preface this here, and I must actually caution that it doesn't mean that we're looking at throwing out a deeper understanding of a given subject or a specialization of a given subject, but to sort of say that with this specialization, how can we communicate with each other and have a more using the specialization, how can we get a better understanding of the system and the interactions between various systems? So what is the proposal for the future, right? So where are we, what should we really be thinking about? And what should we really be discussing about today? Is this issue of, and this idea of resilience. How do we build resilience in our systems, right? And what does resilience really mean? I always think about, a flexible ball. So when you keep pressing it and then it bounces back. So this ability to be able to bounce back from shock, the ability to even sometimes use shock as a benefit. Now that, in very simple words, is what resilience is. So not to collapse under a shock, not to collapse under an extreme condition, but to be able to bounce back, and maybe not bounce back to the previous condition, but bounce back to another condition, because change is the only constant, as we all know. So it's not like it's going to be static, but to be able to bounce back and have and be able to have life on Earth, have life flourishing on Earth, albeit in a slightly different way. So what is very fundamental to resilience? I mean, there are various factors that contribute to resilience, but one very critical element of resilience is diversity, right? And diversity affords several things. Diversity allows for adaptive capacity. Now, adaptive capacity is this ability to be able to sort of come back from a difficult situation. Now, how do we come back from a difficult situation? We have to be equipped with the right skills and tools to be able to come back from a difficult situation, isn't it? So diversity affords us that. And what kind of diversity are we talking about? What does diversity really do, right? It gives you multiple paths. Now, yesterday we talked about, how industrial systems build uniformity and homogeneity. So, for example, in a large monoculture plantation of, say, for example, wheat or rice, right? If a disease hits that field, it's complete decimation of that entire crop, right? But supposing if you had what is agroecologically practiced still in many parts of the country and in many parts of the world, if you had a diverse set of crops which would include cereal and which would include grain, oil seeds, pulses, vegetables, fruit, and if you had this kind of agrobiodiversity, then built into this is the mechanism to be able to overcome disease and to be able to have this adaptive capacity, so that even when there is a drought, for example, or even when there is a disease, for example, you still have some capacity available with you to be able to feed, to be able to maintain the integrity of that ecological system, of that social system where this food system is built, it exists, right? So that is one kind of diversity. So it provides us multiple paths, right? And it also gives us a variety of relationships as well. So some of the things about diversity that I've listed out there, like diversity of sources from which we can get food, diversity of the gene pool, different varieties of crops, different varieties of seeds of a given crop, right? Some seeds, for example, when I think of diversity here, and I think of the tsunami, and this is just one example. We have so many examples available here. So when the tsunami hit in 2004, and the east coast in Tamil Nadu, Pondicherry area was, the paddy fields in many of those areas were completely inundated with saline water, and so people lost soil and people lost productive land. But there were a few farmers in Nagarkoil who had saved saline-resistant paddy seeds, and they were able to then multiply and distribute that and re-establish livelihoods and food systems. So that is the kind of adaptive capacity we're talking about. So that gene pool diversity, right? So and then diversity in governance, diversity in the way we coexist with resources. So for example, community-based collective management of water systems, right? And different forms of governance work in different societies. So it's not this one size fits all that has to be, there is no best form of governance, right? Like, so for example, we've had the governance of the commons. There have been accommodations and negotiations and adaptations that people have had. Yesterday we talked a little bit about the Darfur situation, where you have pastoralists, and in India there are innumerable examples where pastoralists and settled farmers have coexisted, where pastoralists have come on to settled farmers' land when there was residual stubble, so that their animals could graze on it, and left behind the dung. So there are just so many systems of governance and management of resources that existed, and indigenous communities have their own set of governance practices. So so there is a diversity there. Then there is diversity of knowledge of how do we of how do we grow things, of how do we use water, of how do we build homes, right? Architecture, right? Knowledge about that. How do we protect ourselves from disease? So that kind of diversity, right? of experiences, approaches, and livelihoods, of course. Right? So, what diversity affords is it gives us these multiple paths by which we can navigate through life. Right? And that affords a certain flexibility which allows for that ability to bounce back. So, this is really what the idea of resilience is about. So, now we have to really look at ecosystems, and whatever services they provide us. We talked a little bit about this yesterday when we looked at the interconnection between tropical forests. So we were looking at tropical rainforests particularly, and water, the connection between the two. So when we decimate forests, whether it's the Western Ghats or the Amazon, or whether it is in Southeast Asia or in various countries in Africa, when we decimate these forests, we actually impact water resources, right? And that leading to water scarcity, which then in turn, today we are finding how important water is and how critical it is in the suppression of this disease transmission that we've been talking about. We have to keep washing our hands, right, as a means of disinfecting ourselves. So water is such a significant ecosystem service that is so closely connected to this issue of clearance of forests, and there again its relationship with zoonosis. So there are several seeds of resilience that are available for us, right? And I want to point to many resources. There is one which is the Vikalp Sangam. They have put out some resources. Then People's Archives of Rural India, Pari has a whole bunch of stories of how people have, what people have gone through and how people have also built resilience. So there are innumerable resources available for all of you to access, but I will just take a few examples here. So I'm just sort of broadly categorized them. So restoring human-environment relationships, right? Now, there's a very, very fascinating work that has happened in Niger by this one single farmer called Yakuba. And what he did was by understanding how termites exist in nature, and all of you know this, you've seen termite hills. And if you actually look at a cross-section of a termite hill, or if you look at a termite hill that is collapsed, you will find that underground there's this channel of, it's almost like this canal, like this water system channel there. And there is always moisture at the root of termite hills. And there is the symbiotic relationship between termites and fungi, which allow for degradation of wood and therefore returning of nutrients back to soil. So Yakuba had actually looked at this, had been observing termites, and then the termite hills that were destroyed, that had sort of collapsed, he used those channels and made similar channels all over a very dry landscape. And people in the surrounding village thought that he was really being stupid because they hadn't had rains for a long time. So he built these channels, and when they did get the rains, his was one of the few pieces of land in that entire area which greened, because what he had done was he had created channels similar to what termites do, but he had also dug a large number of pits. And when he had the rains, he had also actually spread seeds as well. And so when the rains arrived, he was able to rejuvenate the landscape. And as a result of that rejuvenation, able to build soil over a period of time, and consistently kept getting very high productivity, a mixed cropping system that he was adopting. And over a few years, he was able to actually build significant food security, not just for himself, but for the community. And this was then used as a model by Niger to improve its food security. And similar, such, a lot of such stories are available in India, in Asian countries, in Latin American countries. We only have to look at the traditional water harvesting systems in India, right? Those were very strong human-environment relationships where collective management of resources took place, where there was a sense of ownership and the sense of managing the commons, right, as opposed to separating them into irrigation department and forests, etc., forest department and revenue department, and so on and so forth, right. Also to build, socio-ecological economic networks, and I will take one example. Very recently, there was this very interesting example of collaborative markets, that Adivasi communities in Gudalur have set up. and where they've actually been, over a period of time, they've actually been able to sell their tea in what is called a fair trading mechanism. And people's markets have been set up in various parts of India. And many of these stories are available, like I said, both with Vikalp Sangam and with Pari. And you can actually go to both of these websites and you will find all these stories which are deeply inspirational, which not just inspirational, but they also tell us that this is possible, right? And then there is the food and the seed sovereignty movements in India, the agroecological production systems, which many communities are engaged with. So the seeds of resilience exist. Now the question, of course, is how does this get translated to something bigger, right? And this is where social movements begin to play a big role, whether it is the right to life or the forest rights movement in India, land rights, any of the gender rights. And here I want to take, when we were talking about reclaiming of the commons, this is such a fascinating example in Punjab, where the Mazhabi Sikhs, Dalit community, actually used the Punjab Village Commons Act to reclaim common lands, which was then redistributed among landless Dalit communities. And this helped them actually tide the lockdown conditions during COVID-19. So really taking recourse to a rights-based approach, taking recourse to legislation, invoking this whole issue of the public trust doctrine. So there is legislation that's available in the country. And so how do we use that? How do we educate ourselves about it? And this is what increasingly we all have recognized this, but increasingly more and more people are recognizing the role of social movements and the role of these examples that are available all over the country to bring about this ability to be resilient. And the other question, of course, is examples are fine, they're all local, etc. But is this transformation really possible? And we do have examples of both Cuba and Kerala. Not that they are perfect, but they have shown us that even at a country level or even at a state level, it is possible. Through policies, through investment in education, through investment in primary health care. It takes time, right? But it has to begin. Okay, I mean, often when I provide, when we have discussions, I always hear this, comment saying, this is all fine in places where they've invested, but what about the rest of the places? So the thing is, it's not going to happen overnight. And we can talk more about it when we have a discussion, because I'm very excited to hear what everybody else thinks about these things. So both in Cuba and in Kerala, it was this investment in food, in food systems, in local self-government, in public health, in education, which has resulted. And Cuba's example is unique because they built it on a fossil fuel-free system they started this in 1991, and they have shown us that it's possible at a country level to do that. And I can definitely provide references if people want to read more about these things, because we are sort of at 7:55, and I think it's sort of important for me to stop at this point so that we can have more of a discussion. We can take this in discussion where we talk about what's the role of us as consumers. We did talk a little bit about it yesterday, that the choices we make do impact what brands are available and what is available in the market. They do impact demand. But we don't make these choices in a vacuum, and we really do not have free choice as consumers. A lot of our choice is directed by advertisements, by aspirational standards set by the affluent consumption that happens. So that's very important for us to think about it, because often, particularly policymakers and at a global level as well, individual responsibility is made to be very big, right? That you need to take responsibility for your life. Yes, it's important. However, we also have to push for accountability of structures and institutions. So the only way the only way that we can contribute to building resilience is to be able to work at multiple levels. There are several emerging frameworks. People have talked about, say, they've said, okay, we should have this avoid, shift, improve framework, where we have to avoid some things, like, for example, the need to travel by reimagining our cities. We should shift how we travel from personal transport to mass transport. We need to improve the kind of vehicles we have. So, more and more earlier ways of thinking are emerging, particularly in the time of COVID-19. And this has actually come in a very, very recent publication. So more and more scientists are sort of coming out of this whole understanding and from a modern scientific perspective particularly, it is a huge shift of moving towards a more systems approach as opposed to a more discipline focused and specialization approach. I'm rushing a little bit because I really want us to have more time for discussion. And I'm going to leave you with this sort of last thing, is to think about the fact that, is it possible for us to have multiple worldviews? Because that's the only way to really enable resilience, and this is from the Zapatista movement, which is a world where many worlds fit. And that is how it is. It's not about uniformity. There is a dominant narrative of uniformity, but there exists and there continues to exist a lot of diversity. So how do we actually tilt the scales so that diversity becomes the narrative as opposed to uniformity? And one last point is about this issue of trade-offs. We talked a little bit about it yesterday, and we have to think about this because trade-offs is often thought of as not a very, in not a very complementary fashion. It's almost as we are settling for less. But that's really not true, right? I mean, we are making trade-offs at every point in our life. And trade-offs are a very important element of, it's almost like the middle path, which is something that we really need to think about in the context of resilience. Because you want to be able to keep bouncing back so that life on the planet can be sustained. And trade-offs is a very, very important aspect of it. So I'm going to sort of stop here and say that, I'd like to leave you with this idea that, how we respond to all our challenges and crises, it has to be structurally very different from what has caused us to be where we are. And I'm going to sort of come out of presentation so that we can talk. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry I sort of ran off myself.
Not at all, not at all. It was so lovely. I mean, in fact, this resilience building exercise itself, we were all, engrossed into it.
Thanks. That's kind.
Yeah. So there are people who have already put some questions in the chat, but it would make sense if we allow them to speak. I think you can unmute and then start asking. That would be more, a connected way of, asking questions.
I agree. It would be nice to have a conversation. Yeah.
Could one of you nominate who should be unmuted and speak first? I won't jump the queue.
Okay.
You can take the lead, sir.
It's okay, but Nussair, since you have jumped, why don't you start?
Oh my God, I might end up taking the rest of the half hour. Basically, what I'm getting out of all of this is that we are requiring to almost reconnect to the commons in different modes and different fashions. And what I thought of this was, it hasn't worked so far. Ministry of Environment and Forests is coming out with a new statement where they're going to remove the impact piece. Development worship is such that we are bypassing many environmental issues and stakeholders such as the Adivasis and local people involved in that. So I hate to say that it's an Indian trait or anything of that sort, but across India we definitely neglect the commons, if not outright trash them. Mm-hmm. So this concept of taking back control of producing and consuming, even for that matter, of regulating our lives, that itself to me seems almost unattainable. But maybe I'm just being pessimistic. So going beyond that then, what are possible new measures of growth? Or, to set up new sustainable goals? And would those be based on things like food sovereignty, which is an impossible word to spell, or resilience? And, whatever ideas you have on that. And I'll shut up finally.
No, that's fine. Nussair, I think very important points. And I agree with you that it can be very overwhelming, and which is why often, see, the thing is, you don't want paralysis, right? I mean, we don't want to be paralyzed by this whole thing. So we have to do what we can do where we are, right? But it's important to understand that it is possible, and to also be able to find things that one can, to find things where change can be brought about in one's own situation, either through personal engagement or being part of a larger movement. That's one element. But the issue of commons that you talked about, right? Now, this example that I gave you of the Mazhabi Sikhs happened right now, 2014. Okay, so people are so there is there is legal recourse. Social movements are working, so it is possible to. It seems like an uphill task, but unless a beginning is made at various points in this whole, in this whole network of systems that we have, it's got to happen at multiple points. Okay. So, and unless we begin to even have these conversations and think about it, and have more of these engagements, more of it being brought into our education system. And I'm not talking merely about the formal education system. I'm also talking about education outside of the formal education system. So that is how I think that's how I would think about it. And about pessimism, well, there's optimism, pessimism, and realism, right? I mean, it's really a function of. But I think it's so important for all of us to really constantly question a certain givens that we take. I think that is where the problem is. We take a lot as given, and we assume that it can't be changed. And it's interesting to see how it can be when we see people under very dire situations actually bringing about change. Right? I know it's a bit of a convoluted response that I gave you, but yeah. But I mean, I'd be happy if anybody else would like to comment on it, and maybe we'll take. We'll come back, Nusser, to this, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who have this question that you've raised. And if maybe Devika, you want to go ahead with your question, you want to sort of.
Yes, ma'am. So I just wanted to ask. First of all, I have got a lot of information about the food web and the planetary web through these 3 sessions. And I would also like to ask that what is the role of land reforms in developing resilience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the structural issues that I was pointing to today, and we talked a little bit about it yesterday, right? Because land is when we were talking about the milk situation, land is at the heart. Land reforms is at the heart of any kind of change that we want to bring about. Today's agrarian crisis in India, at the heart of it is the fact that we have not done land reforms anywhere in the country except probably in Kerala and West Bengal to some extent. So that is really a fundamental issue, and that's a structural change that has to be brought about. Now, there are very strong, land rights movements that are working towards it. There have been some successes in many locations. I only gave you one example in Punjab. There are 3 other examples from Punjab. The Dalit movement, which has been very strong in the land rights. So land reforms are a very, very critical part of developing resilience, because it is about having the ability, right? I mean, when we talked about diversity and adaptive capacity, right? If you don't have the adaptive capacity, if you don't have access to a resource, how do you realize your potential? How do you become, and at the heart of something like food sovereignty? Again, it is about access to land, to be able to either grow food yourself or to be able to have other people grow food, right? So, and also it's about, again, the whole issue of inequity, right, in communities. I mean, at the heart of that is this inequitable distribution of resources, and land reforms is very much at the heart of it. Yes, very much.
And there is another question also I have, like availability of fertile land. A lot of fertile land is being lost due to construction and building. So what can be done in order to preserve the fertile land?
Okay, now that's it's so legislation driven, right? I mean, so for example, I'll just tell you what has happened in Kerala a flip of it that happened in Kerala because of COVID-19. The government has actually gone out to modify legislation in order to be able to use fallow land in the state, okay, and land that has not been used or cultivated for a long period of time, fallow land in the state, for anybody who wants to do farming, and also state sort of groups like Kudumbashri, for example, women's groups and others, to use this fallow land to grow food to become self-sufficient. So legislative change has been, so there's actually been a change in legislation to accommodate that. So the owner of the land does not lose ownership of the land, but the land gets used by somebody else to grow food. Okay? So legislative change is very, very important, and that's what a lot of rights movements are engaged with, is to bring about, like whether it was a right to information or Forest Rights Act. That's a very good example. Of course, Forest Rights Act is getting deeply eroded. That is a reality. But it is largely through these kind of, which is where social movements, create those inflection points. Yeah. So let's see if somebody else, not at all, let's see if somebody else wants to, has a question. I think there's one question here, which is, kindly give a link for this example of dry land flourishing with extensive channel building, right? Yeah, do you want to go? Yeah. It's Alamelu, right? Yeah.
Yeah, one minute, ma'am. As far as Tamil Nadu is concerned, as you have said, before 5 years back, there was many dryland farming. Dryland farming was the huge sector of the farming in Tamil Nadu, but now we have lost that. We are mainly depending on we are also converting the drylands to irrigatable land.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is causing a lot of havoc, and also, and everything is being ordered now.
Maybe if you cut out your video, then the bandwidth may improve, right? If you cut out your video and keep the audio, just mute your video and keep the audio. You may be, I think this may be better for you.
So it will be So as you rightly said, by improving our channels and within our lands itself, we can harvest a lot of rainwaters and use the dry land effectively.
That's right.
It was nice by seeing from you.
Okay.
And the other thing, as far as the micronutrient is concerned, ma'am, moringa, which is flourishing in Tamil Nadu, is being glorified in Africa. Is now.
Alameda, maybe can you put it into the chat box? Then I can read it out to the others so that we can, if you have the audio. So while Alumelu is actually putting it into the chat box, Nusser, you had a point here about please do give the successful examples of transformation in Cuba and Kerala, and I think some amount of it, I just sort of rushed through it a little bit, but I'd be very happy to share the readings or the references which will give you a little bit more detail, much more detail about the exact mechanism. Yeah, that might be.
There are a couple of comments and a question, I think, by Sanjay Gadale on Facebook Live. So I'm just going to put that copy paste into the chat box.
Okay.
Yeah, you may have a look at it.
Yeah. Can our sustainable practices actually bring a balance with the growth in consumption as humanity? Well, again, when we use words like sustainability and sustainable practices, it's so important for us to sort of define what it really means. What do we understand as sustainable practices? And if we truly understand it in the context of ecological, economic, social, cultural, ethical, emotional, that's so many levels. Can it actually bring a balance with the growth in consumption and humanity? Well, that is the attempt, isn't it? That reducing consumption, when we say reducing consumption, we're talking about consumption of a certain kind and in certain context and for a certain section of society, right? And how real is the Malthusian conundrum? Is there a need for regular extermination of humankind to allow the balance between growth, sustainability, and consumption? I am not sure. I am not a big, I don't know. See, the thing is also, if we were to go with the Gaia theory, right? At some point, the regulation of the planet will be such that it'll probably result in, not so much. I don't think humankind will ever get exterminated, and I would like to go back to what Yuval Noah Harari, the historian, has talked about in the 3 books that he's written, and I must say I tend to have an agreement there that I don't think the human species. It's not about extermination in one go of the human species. In some form or the other, life will continue to exist, and possibly the human species will also continue to exist, if not in this form, in some other form. But what we're really talking about, I think, when we talk about sustainability and its relationship to consumption, is that we are questioning the fact that today human activity is dominating the regulation of planetary conditions. And that is what needs to change, because there is a fundamental problem right there, because we are impacting the existence of many other life forms. So that is really the issue. So yes, I mean, we go with this hope that sustainable practices, at the heart of which is a reduction in consumption. And remember, sustainability is a journey, right? It's not like we take a practice and it finishes. Like, for example, if you were to take water consumption, right? You reduce water consumption, right? By fundamentally by the amount of water that you draw. Then the water that you use, you recycle, you reuse it in as many ways as possible, right? So then that brings about a shift. So maybe you have just reduced the amount of water that you consume, but can you reduce it further? In where have you reduced it? So for example, if we were to take rural and urban areas, right? Urban areas, because we use flush toilets, by that very condition, it's a default condition where we consume much more water than in a rural environment. So we have to really think about, we really have to completely, transform our way of thinking at one level, but we also have to think about restoration, right? And we also have to, and we talked a little bit about it on the first day and yesterday, that we're really, in the context of forests, when we said, you remove forests and then you plant trees, and isn't that enough? But you've actually destroyed an ecosystem. So how do you regenerate that ecosystem, right? The focus should be on regeneration. And I think that's what Madhu is also saying here, that we need to go beyond sustainability now. And sustainability, again, the way it's defined, the way it's understood, there is just so much, and I alluded to the whole sustainable development goals thing, right? So there is so much confusion there in this understanding of sustainability, because in its true sense, when we talk about sustainable development, it's a bit of an oxymoron, because at the heart of sustainable development is unfettered, is economic growth. And we really have to, there are several schools which are talking about ideas of degrowth, talking about, Nusser was talking about how are you going to, ways of measuring our well-being, ways of measuring our fulfillment, ways of measuring success, not through the standard economic indicators of GDP, not through such indicators, but is there other ways of understanding or attaining, not just self-sufficiency, but a kind of a flourishing or a sense of or well-being. Now, for example, the Human Development Index, and Amartya Sen and a whole host of other researchers have worked extensively on that, where you're looking at a multifunctionality way of understanding well-being, and rather than just measuring poverty, or rather than just measuring success in a particular way, but really looking at well-being, because well-being is about the ability of a human being of being able to realize their ability and capability. And realization of your ability and capability can only happen when the environment allows you to flourish, right? So it's a very, at one level, it's a very existential sort of a question that we're talking about. Alarmelu's point about that moringa, which flourishes in Tamil Nadu, is glorified in Africa as a micronutrient, and oats being grown in Australia is glorified in India. So, also that, moringa and several other things are being called superfoods, right? Which always were part of traditional diets, traditionally diversified dietary systems. So So yeah, I mean, it's we really have to step away from this again, this silos, this fragmented issue of, like, say, for example, when we talk about nutrition, right? We talk about it in terms of carbohydrates, proteins, fats, as opposed to talking about it as food. And so these are some of the ways of thinking that have to change. And if we want to really build resilience, it's restructuring, really. That is what is important. No, that's very true. I mean, Madhu, it's absolutely, yeah. So it's fundamentally what we were saying yesterday and day before as well, is this fragmented, silo-wise, reductionist approach, which is a very significant part of our education system. And also, over the years, it has, it has deeply conditioned our way of thinking. So, yeah. And there are so many, various systems of food systems that are available today, and which many people are practicing in various pockets. So the question is, how does there are several questions here. One is, like we said, it's not that there is a model that has to be replicated, but whatever we build, whatever systems we build, or whatever we rejuvenate, regenerate, recreate, it has to be very context specific. It has to be contextual. There cannot be one solution that can be replicated, multiplied, scaled up, because those very terminologies are a very industrial system sort of an approach. And what's interesting is that, recently in Nature, there have been three articles written by, very conventional scientist teams, which are pushing for a re-evaluation and re-look at capitalist economic systems. So it's kind of interesting to see this discussion being put forth by traditional scientists. Some of them are physicists and some of them are biologists. So there itself, I see a lot of hope in this shift in thinking.
I was speaking to one of the agricultural scientists at a place called NAM here. Mm-hmm. There is an agricultural research institution. Mm-hmm. So he was of the strong proponents of having this laboratory meat and food produced in the laboratory, where it tastes similar to the original meat.
Right.
Yeah, and also he is of the opinion that we don't need acres of land. Even with few acres of land, you can provide food to the entire city. So could you just tell something about this whole concept of growing food in the laboratories?
Well, if we were to sort of even look at it at a very simplistic, from a very simplistic perspective, even superficial, right? If you were to look at it from a climate change perspective, okay, I'm just going to talk about a couple of dimensions. One is the climate change perspective. From an ecological perspective, you have to construct these laboratories, okay? So that in itself expends enormous amount of fossil fuel. So that's a very simple argument for it, okay? But a more complex one is that what happens to all of the livelihoods, right? What happens to the livelihoods of all of the farmers? What happens to the smaller, isn't it? I mean, so I don't understand the justification for something like that, right? I mean, land, to make land more productive and to get more out of a piece of land, agroecological practices do that immensely well. And there are so many agroecological practices that have evolved. There are so many schools of agroecology, whether it is biodynamic farming or permaculture or natural farming. I mean, so many practices that are available, but one is looking at practices that are unique to a given context. So you adapt the practices that are unique to that given context, right? From where it is absolutely possible to, and we talked a little bit about the nutrition per acre yesterday, right? As opposed to the yield per acre, right?
Yeah.
So also we're talking about it from an the integrity of an ecosystem, right? So when we talk about something like laboratory grown food, we're talking about an enormous input of external resources, which are by and large, again, extractive in nature, requiring some definitely intense forms of energy. So I think that is where there are arguments of this nature also for production of meat. That we should be producing meat in laboratories. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to avoid the violence that we do to the animals and so on.
Right.
A whole bunch of ideas.
That's right. I mean, there are many, right? I mean, many people are grappling with this whole question. But then again, it comes back to the fact that when you grapple for answers, if we are approaching it with a sense of looking for a end solution, unfortunately, that doesn't exist, because you respond to a change which creates another condition to which you respond again, right? So there isn't an end to this process, right? So even when we talk about sustainability is this journey of minimizing your impact on the planet. And so there is no end to this journey. That's something that we have to understand. And once we begin to understand that, then the approach becomes very different. So Vignesh has a question here, or your thoughts on population and how long will it take to move to rural side development from urban to decongest densely populated cities? I think we talked a little bit about this yesterday as well on the first day about population, right? Yes, I mean, there is a reality, of course. If there are more human beings, there is going to be a greater demand of resources. That's a direct relationship. But to say that, and this was what was the original theory, both Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb, saying that it's developing countries who are producing more children, and therefore the impact on the earth, on the planet is very high, and so less children need to be produced. Okay, but then to sort of push that as the only argument, that is where there is a problem. Because if you were to look at the consumption of a few affluent, of a small percentage of the affluent consumption, it is, I mean, if you were to look at per capita consumption numbers, right? If you were to compare that, it is very, very evident from any data that has been put out there that affluent consumption has such a big impact compared to, so it's not just about population, is my point, okay? And one has to focus significantly on consumption as well. And how long will it take to move to, I'm not sure I understand. Vignesh, if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, that might be easier. Because I'm not sure I understand what you say, what you mean by how long will it take to move to rural site development from urban. So Vignesh, please feel free to unmute and ask the question. Or put your point across here.
While we're waiting for Vignesh to respond, let me jump in and ask you, is there an update you have? Is Vijaya Dairy still procuring milk locally in Hyderabad, which is where I'm based?
Right. No, but yes, I mean, Vijaya Dairy is a state cooperative, no? So a lot of small farmers pour milk to Vijaya Dairy. Yes. It's still very much, yeah, very much. I mean, all of them, whether it's Vijaya or, it's only the
Sangam Dairy.
It's only the the private companies, sort of the corporations that we're talking about, which source from both small, but primarily from large dairy farms. Yeah.
Thanks. I don't know if Vignesh has gotten a chance to recollect.
Yes. Yeah. So Vignesh, if you're not able to unmute, you can actually maybe elaborate on that question a little bit, and then we can all sort of see what we think about it. Okay, so in India, everyone's moving to cities in search of jobs. Yeah, but there's a lot of reverse migration that has happened now. Yes, that is true. But this decongesting of densely populated cities now, as long as we place primacy on urban. So why do people move to urban areas, right? The belief of better opportunities, because our rural, because of the situation in various parts of the country, where livelihoods have been decimated in rural areas because of policies, because of natural conditions, but largely because of policies and political decisions that have been taken, which has resulted in the agrarian crisis, which has seriously impacted livelihoods, and that is pushing people to move out. That's one of the main reasons that people move out, in order to be able to find better opportunities. Right? So unless we really begin to completely reform our policies, and with land reform being at the heart of it, which requires tremendous amount of political will, and also remember the power structures. Those who are in politics do really come from the large property owners, or at least who are supported by large landowners, by the landowning lobby, by corporations who want a lot of the land, by infrastructure projects which have vested interests in them, right? So it's not just about the agricultural policies, it's about the land policies, it's about the resource governance policies. So as a result of all of this, when people lose their livelihoods, they have no other option but to come to urban areas where there are more opportunities, whether it is, and by and large, it is very, it's either labor, it's casual labor more often than not, or it's seasonal labor more often than not, or it is jobs which at least provide some sort of a income. In rural areas which are close to urban areas, it could be people working in people's homes, it could be people working in factories in cities, it could be people selling things in cities, working in retail in cities. So there are all of these reasons why people move. So the decongesting of cities is a very complex problem, and it has to be looked at from that structural perspective. And it's not just in India, right? It's the world over that cities provide a dream of better healthcare facilities. There's a perception of better healthcare facilities, better education facilities for children, all of that. So if you have good primary healthcare, if you have good education facilities in rural areas, if education is universalized, and if healthcare is, then the situation will be very different. Yeah, actually, if anybody has any reflections or even thoughts on, what we've sort of gone through the last 3 days, that would be wonderful as well. I mean, we can sort of. There is no, we can't wrap this up with a neat bow and walk away, unfortunately, because this is about our lives. But if there are any larger and larger reflections or comments, and there's one from Madhu where she's talking about water. It's a big part. Yes, I mean, as they say, the wars of the future are going to be fought over water, as they were over oil till now are going to be fought over water. It's absolutely. Yeah. So any comments, any reflections, any thoughts, that would be great.
No, I was just thinking, because I also teach at a private university where the students feel that nature is infinite, and it is so much of abundance that it gives, and you can actually go on consuming more and more.
Right.
So that kind of perception we need to change, and they feel that they have the affordability, they can buy things. So if at all there is a change that we need to begin, it should begin from the individual, I feel.
Yeah, that's true. That I agree with you, Naeem. I mean, the individual has a lot of responsibility, but I also feel it's increasingly important for the individual to begin with oneself, but also to engage with the collective. Because the way society is today is that at an individual level, many people do many things, right? But the engagement with the larger collective seems to have sort of morphed into something else. And I think one of the things that I would really like to say is, these discussions can be sometimes overwhelming, can be sometimes very and discouraging as well. But what I'd like to encourage is that there are just so many instances of these seeds of resilience that people have sown. I would actively encourage people to sort of look at more of these stories and also engage more actively around you through conversations, through because it has to begin with conversation. There are no solutions out there. Nobody has solutions, right? Yeah. But we have to think about this collectively, and so often, collectively. And I want to give this very, very lovely, point here, which I hope will be encouraging, is that when I used to work with a small group of farmers in the Madanpalli area, I used to we used to have meetings once a week every night, and we used to sort of talk about, and our focus was issues of food sovereignty, but it was also much larger issues, the day-to-day problems of semi-arid locations and the day-to-day problems of life, of trying to live in resource-fragile areas. And at the end of 1 year, I just asked, so what's the point, right? I mean, what am I doing here, coming every week and having these conversations? Is there any value to this, So, because the problems persisted, but, there was just a lot more conversation. So the response I got was that, no, this allows us, your coming here allows us to actually talk to each other. Otherwise, we are very busy with our lives, with our fields, with our animals, etc. And we don't make the time to sit together once a week like this and have a conversation. And we realized that through these conversations, we're able to collectively think about ways to resolve issues, which I thought was so encouraging. And for me, that's been a big learning in my life. And so I'm an active proponent of collective conversations, which lead to action.
That's very encouraging, Dr. Gopalan, to hear that.
Yes.
Okay, so if there are no further, reflections, questions, or queries, I think on that note of resilience, we can sign out this 3-day, night school. It was so lovely to have you, Radha, for this, night school, right from the conceptualization of the 3-day night school and the note that you sent, and a marvelous delivery, I would say. And
thank you.
Yeah, it's really a sheer pleasure to listen to you.
No, thank you. My God, I mean, it's so difficult to, sort of put these pieces together like this, and I'm not sure, and because it's a conversation, it was actually very, very encouraging for me that we have so many people and we could all sort of, talk to each other and think collectively. So then I decided that since this is a collective conversation, I will just put some thoughts out there and we can take it from there. But thank you all. I mean, this has been for me, it's been a hugely learning experience because of the points, the questions, all of the engagement that we've had. And I'm very, very excited because I think we have another community now.
Yeah.
And somebody had asked for my email. I put my email out there. So, if there's any way that I can sort of share anything with you, be great. And I look forward to continuing this conversation, actually.
Definitely. And Lamakaan would look forward to have you time and again.
Oh, I would love to. You've unleashed something, Naeem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, on that note, thank you once again. I thank you profusely from my bottom of the heart and personally, and also behalf of Lamakaan for making your presence felt throughout the 3 days. And we look forward to your company again. And thank you.